All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? It looks like we have a really great size group and a few more people joining. Hi, everyone. I am Ari Shah. I'm the Director of International Programs at the Williams Institute. The Williams Institute, if you're not familiar, is a research center based at the University of California, Los Angeles, focused on sexual orientation and gender identity law and public policy. And today it is my distinct privilege to moderate this session on the economic case for LGBTI equality with the preeminent expert, as far as I'm concerned, on the topic, and the person who quite literally wrote the book, The Economic Case for LGBTI Equality, Why Fair and Equal Treatment Benefits Us All. I am delighted to introduce Lee Badgett. Lee, you have her bio. As you know, she's a professor of economics and the former director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's also a Williams Distinguished Scholar at the Williams Institute, where she was a co-founder and the first research director. She has a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. Unfortunately, Yvonne Wilmari was initially going to join us, but she's unable to. But we hope we can still have a really interesting and productive conversation and really engage a lot of great questions and comments from all of you. If you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And just to get things going, I'll ask a few questions to kick off the session, and then we'll open it up for questions from everyone in the session. So please feel free to post questions at any time. Also, if you prefer to ask something verbally or provide a comment that way, that's also great as well. And just select the button to submit your audio and video. Fantastic. So just to get started, Lee, you have really spent decades researching the impact of stigma and discrimination on LGBTI people. And for many of us in the community, I think this is something that is sort of deeply felt and understood on a personal level. And I think many of us understand LGBTI equality in terms of fundamental human rights, right? That we are entitled to equal treatment and a life that is safe and free of stigma and discrimination by virtue of our humanity, right? That discrimination is categorically wrong. I think for some time now, we've seen more efforts to quantify and measure that impact, and that this framing is being taken up by more and different kinds of stakeholders across the movement. International organizations like the World Bank, to chambers of commerce, to LGBTI advocacy groups are advancing aspects of these arguments in different ways. Just this week, many of you may have seen, there was a report by Credit Suisse that provided, once again, an analysis that they've done before that showed that businesses that have inclusive policies around sexual orientation and gender identity perform better. And this, of course, was the same day that NASDAQ proposed new listing rules that require most NASDAQ listed companies to have at least one board member who self-identifies as either an underrepresented minority or as LGBTQ+. So there's movement in this space for sure, but for some of us, it might still be new to think about impact of discrimination in this way, and that there are measurable costs to discrimination. And in fact, as I recall, there was quite a bit of skepticism when you started this type of analysis. So to begin, can you tell us a bit about how you came to think about the impact of stigma and discrimination in this way, and how it is that there are measurable economic costs to discriminating against LGBTI people?
Thanks, Ari. Great question, a great big question. Yeah. And thanks to everybody who's to the conversation. Yeah, I think that's a really great place to start, because that is the way we normally think about discrimination, stigma, violence in the context of human rights, and those as human rights violations. And absolutely, that's how I got into this kind of work, was thinking about the experiences that LGBT people have, especially in the workplace, and then how that creates economic inequality. So that's absolutely important to think about. And I think the thing is that the kinds of treatment that we're talking about are not just bad for us as individuals, if we are LGBTI people ourselves, but it can have a larger impact on other people. And then more specifically, it can have a larger impact on the economy. So I'm an economist, and I think about things like education, even from the perspective of economics. So you can think about it as a place where we know LGBTI people face lots of challenges. UNESCO found 94 countries that had done research on this topic and found that the experience of bullying and harassment and discrimination of LGBTI young people in schools is rampant. It's a huge problem. And so the way I think about that, in addition to being a problem for the LGBTI young people, is that it's hurting what's really at the core of our economies, which is people. It's people's knowledge, people's skills, their creativity. We even have a word for this in economics. It sounds a little bit harsh. We call it human capital, but we call it that because it doesn't go away when you use it up. When you get an education, you've got a lifetime to use it, basically. So when bullying and discrimination make it more likely that LGBTI young people will drop out of school, as we know from research, that they'll have lower grades, that they will, they're less likely to continue on in education. We know that that's going to take away some of that ability to contribute, some of those skills, knowledge, creativity, our human capital to contribute. What's interesting is that it turns out there's also some research that suggests that bullying in general, not just for LGBTI people, but or against them, but bullying in general reduces the ability of schools to be good learning environments, and students don't learn as much. So it's clear that there's a connection from the individual level, kind of up to the economic level. This seems maybe a little more understandable when we talk about something like employment and employment discrimination, right? So discrimination means you're not hiring somebody who can do a really good job. Somebody who's equally or maybe better qualified doesn't get an opportunity. And so that's inefficient for our economy. It means we're not really using everybody's skills and talent. And for LGBTI people, it gets worse than that, though, of course, because if you are in the workplace, you have to make these sometimes very challenging decisions about how open to be. There's emerging research on this that suggests that those kinds of decisions they hurt us and our ability to produce, because it takes up energy. It takes psychic energy to try to hide who we are. It sounds so simple, but it's not. It's really not. So that's another thing that kind of holds back our contributions, on top of perhaps coming in with less education, or not as high a quality and quantity as we could have. And so we know that people face discrimination in the workplace. Still, in the United States, where we live and work, 1 in 5 LGBT people reports they've experienced some kind of discrimination. The EU's Fundamental Rights Agency just came out with a new study of all the countries in the EU, and actually found pretty much the same number. 1 in 5 people have experienced discrimination in the workplace recently. Actually, a study I did with some scholars in Hong Kong, we analyzed data from China. And again, we found at least 1 in 5 people that report that they've experienced this kind of discrimination. Now, I don't think that 1 in 5 number necessarily applies everywhere. Yeah. That's a pretty big number. It's a lot of people, right, who are experiencing discrimination. And those other 4 people are probably worried about it, right? So it takes a toll when we have to worry, when we have to think about whether or not how open we're going to be. And then, the other way to think about both of these is that they can contribute to health problems, to mental health problems, for example, or physical health problems. Psychologists and public health researchers call this minority stress. Everybody faces stress in life. So we can't get away from that. But people who are in disadvantaged positions, like LGBTI people or women or people of color, we face extra stress, and that takes a toll on our bodies. It makes us worry about it too, even if we don't experience something bad. And we think that's why we see big health disparities. And again, we have research, a growing body of research from lots of different countries that show that LGBTI people have higher rates of HIV. That's maybe not so surprising, but higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, higher rates of thinking about suicide, higher rates of violence, which can cause physical and mental harm. So there's lots of examples of ways that all of these things fit together in a really bad cycle. And if you're reducing health, you're reducing people's education, you're discriminating against them in the workplace, in all these cases, you're holding back what we can contribute to the economy. So it's got to have an effect. It's got to have an effect. We're not a huge group, but we face big problems. And so it's very likely to add up to a large effect.
And so what does that add up to? How do you sort of quantify that in a way that, packs a meaningful punch when we're talking about economic costs?
Yeah. Can we put it into numbers? Yeah. So we've tried to do that in lots of different ways. Actually, one way that businesses have done it, you mentioned that Credit Suisse report. There is a body of research in the academic world that shows that businesses that are more inclusive of LGBTI people have higher stock prices. That's what they were focused on. Have better financial performance. They're more profitable. That is to say, they're more productive. They have higher levels of productivity for their workers. So businesses kind of have been working from this premise for a while. So it's not a crazy idea to try to add it up. And so I've tried to do this in a couple contexts. In India, a project I did for the World Bank, who was interested in this stuff. The Philippines, the Williams Institute did a study of South Africa a year or so ago that came out recently. And then Open for Business has done a similar project in Kenya. And if we take those 4 examples that we have, and actually there's been some research on this in Canada. If you take those 4 examples and look at the range of effects that they find. So they take, what happens to people in employment, discrimination, what happens in health, add some other issues like around tourism. And they say, let's put a dollar value on the losses to our economy. And it's right around 1% of GDP. And GDP is our big measure of economic output, gross domestic product. And although 1%, seems like it's really on the small end of numbers. If we had drops of 1% of GDP, we would call that a recession. It's not as big as the recession that we're going through now globally, but it's a meaningful drop. So the way I think about it is we're putting ourselves into a permanent recession. So that's another way to think about it, to actually put some numbers to it.
And we also can look at it from the opposite direction too, right? Or there's research that shows not only are there costs to exclusion, but an inclusive economy is actually stronger and linked with better economic performance, right?
Yes, yeah. So that's another way to think about it, kind of like the big global view. So in several studies, colleagues at Williams and elsewhere and I have looked to see if we can see that sort of pattern. So if this is right, then we should see that countries that are more inclusive have better economic performance overall. And that's exactly what we find. We've looked at this in lots of different ways. We've done this for emerging economies and looked at the laws and how they've evolved there, and find that for those kind of low and medium income, fast growing economies, having one more right is associated with about a 3% increase in GDP. It doesn't mean, if you pass one, if you decriminalize, you'll immediately get that. But over time, that's kind of what that difference looks like. We've looked at it with regard to the whole, 130 countries, so most of the world. We've looked at it, not just looking at laws as measures of inclusion, although I think those are very important because they help give us a path to opening up, being more inclusive. They probably reflect more inclusion if they are if they're based on court decisions or legislative law changes. And we've also looked at it with regard to broader public acceptance. So Andrew Flores, our colleague at Williams, has created something called the Global Acceptance Index, and it kind of pulls together all the public opinion polls all over the world for lots and lots of years, and kind of boils it down to one measure per year. And so we've taken that and we've looked to see if there's a correlation with GDP per capita. And again, yes, more accepting countries with more inclusive laws tend to do better. They have higher GDP per capita than countries that are otherwise similar but don't have those. that kind of acceptance. So we can see it at that level as well.
You know, one of the perhaps obvious implications of the economic case is that it really opens up space for businesses to become both targets of advocacy and activists themselves. And so I wonder, you know, from the work that you've done in this area, what should companies be doing? You know, you imagine if it's good for the bottom line and companies want to be able to recruit and retain the best talent, this should be sort of a no-brainer. And yet we still, as you stated at the top, see discrimination, you know, businesses discriminating and then LGBT employees facing discrimination. So what should companies be doing?
Yeah, they've got a lot to do, that's for sure. I mean, I think you've kind of hit on both of those angles. I think, you know, there are policies that companies can change that will make them more inclusive, and you can track those. So for instance, the Human Rights Campaign has a corporate equality index. Stonewall UK's got an index. Community business in Hong Kong's got an index. You know, for Asia, so the index business is getting big, which is great because it means that we can, you know, we can look and see how well companies are doing. We can benchmark that, and so there has been evolution. There are trends towards the big companies being much more inclusive. So actually, it's kind of interesting because there's something about the way you asked that question that makes me want to say this. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not one of those economists who believes that, you know, the invisible hand will like make everything better. All we have to do is just sit back and wait. That is not how that worked for all these businesses. The way it worked was, you know, people pushed them, people internally mostly. Their employees were pushing them, saying, hey, you know, your policy of non-discrimination doesn't include sexual orientation or gender identity. So are you saying that means it's okay to discriminate? No, it's not okay. You know, we want you to add those. And so, you know, in the US, the Fortune 500 is pretty universal on both of those. Same thing with benefits for the same-sex partners or gender affirmation benefits. It happened because people internally were pushing them. And so to some extent, it is happening because they see their competitors doing it. So that's a very nice dynamic to have, where you have, you know, people saying inside, we need this stuff, and on the outside saying, oh, we better provide that stuff, or else we might not be able to hire the best people. So both of those kinds of things have pushed companies, I think. Now, the question about multinational companies is a really interesting one because they operate in lots of different places. So could they be a conductor of change, right? So from one place to another, and they certainly can be, and I think a lot of them want to be. I mean, I think that that's the story of Open for Business in a way, and for some of the other efforts to pull together coalitions of corporations. They can stand together and make make a statement together that they, you know, that doesn't make them stick out too much if they're worried about how they'll be perceived in you know, the countries they're operating in that are more conservative. So that's good that they can work together. And what's interesting is, you know, guess what their argument is? It's the business case. It's the economic case. And that's one that makes sense. They can stand behind that, and it doesn't look like they're meddling in the companies where they're operating. They're saying we need our environment to be supportive of our LGBTI employees, and we need it so that we can move people around. We need it so that we can, you know, attract and retain the best people, and we need it so that our employees are safe in the countries that they live in. So I'm doing a case study right now, working on one in a new project, looking at this for one big multinational company, and they are, you know, spreading benefits gradually over time. I mean, what their idea is that, you know, they have to be culturally sensitive to the places they operate in. But their global policies give them an opportunity to start the discussion at the local level, and they can prepare the ground. They can find local allies. They can find LGBTI employees who want to be part of this, or sometimes they respond to LGBTI employees' voices to start that process of making change. So spreading out from the the countries, like the U.S. or Canada, and moving into other countries, India or the Philippines, or Kenya, to kind of make sure that their policies are in alignment. So it's a process, I think, in that way. So they're part of that, and they need to hear from us. They need to hear, internally from their LGBTI employees, and they need to hear from people in their larger environments to kind of keep that movement going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And just to note to everyone, I invite you to please submit questions and comments in the chat. We have one sort of related to the point you were making, Lee, from Cliff Cortez, noting that HR policies matter for company employees, but for companies that have great reach in societies, public messaging and images are important for different reasons. So really kind of touching on the sort of internal and external dynamics of that business role that you're talking about.
And they know that, and they know that, their employees who hear, guess what we found out today at work, when they're at home, we're going to be providing, benefits for transgender people, or benefits for same-sex partners. And that's a way to kind of take the conversation from the workplace into the community to make change there too. They're I think some companies are very conscious of that, and some they're actually strategizing around that. That is one of their goals, actually, in many cases.
I'm hoping that we can hear more about how the economic case applies or might apply in other contexts. But I'm just curious, given a lot of the work that you've done, particularly around advancing this argument in the United States, how important has the economic argument been for turning the tide on LGBT rights in the US, to the extent we're seeing progress?
Yeah, it's always hard to know, what different arguments make. I think this particular argument is most likely to make a dent in certain kinds of places. So businesses are an obvious place because it speaks to their bottom line, to their mission, what drives them. I think it can speak to people in places that aren't normally focused on human rights. I mean, I think, Cliff, you could yell at me if I'm wrong about this, but the World Bank is not a human rights agency. It's deeply, it will affect people's human rights, but that's not what moves them necessarily. And so, they've been doing a lot of the research that they've done, that study that I mentioned in India. It's all about showing why it's so important for the things that are in their mission, shared prosperity, reducing poverty. These are all things that matter for those countries. And if they think that LGBTI inclusion is a good way to move forward on that, then multilateral financial institutions, or there's lots of development banks that I've heard do a lot of them. This is an argument that's kind of designed to appeal to them. I think we lost Ari. He'll be back. I hope that's you lost Ari and not me, because I'm still talking. Yes, we hear you.
Can you see me?
We can't see you. No, we can't see you. Yep, we just got your picture.
Did that work?
No.
Oh, looks like, I think people can see me. Maybe I just disappeared from your screen.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's see. So so the development banks, I think those are places where it can be important. I mean, I can point to examples where I have found kind of eager audiences for some of this kind of work. Around marriage equality is a great example. In the U.S. at the Williams Institute, we were often asked to respond to certain kinds of economic arguments, like can my state really afford to let same-sex couples get married because they get all these benefits, and won't that be too expensive for us? That's an economic argument. And we could, and we did, go in and say, here's what it really looks like if you add it all up. Actually, your state will be better off in terms of its budget if it lets same-sex couples get married. So we did a bunch of those, and actually I did one for Australia. More specifically for the state of Tasmania there. Tasmania turns out to be kind of a destination, a wedding destination location. And so I was there giving some, had been invited to give some talks, and ended up speaking to a couple of guys from the local small business council in Hobart, Tasmania, which is the capital. And, so we're sitting around a table, and I'm kind of giving them my spiel about, here's how much money Tasmania would make from people flying there from other parts of Australia to get married if they allowed same-sex couples to marry there. And they're like, okay. And then at the end, I sort of paused and waited for their verdict. And they said, oh, this was really interesting. We never thought about it that way. That makes total sense. And in fact, those guys, that organization became a big booster of marriage equality. As it was discussed in Tasmania, they came out in favor of it, came out in favor nationally. So, I think there's, because people don't think about us that way. They don't think about these issues that way. Sometimes you just have to reframe it for them and give them another reason to care, another reason to be supportive. You might not always think it's the best reason. Maybe human rights, it'd be better if everyone believed in the human rights arguments. I believe that, but sometimes that's just not going to be what convinces people. And I would just say, this is the reason I wrote this book, was because I heard exactly that from activists all over the world. We need something else. We need another argument to present in these kinds of situations. So that's where the book came from.
I think Liam Brown, did you have a question or an intervention?
No, sorry, I'm just having a lot of audio problems, so I'm trying every option to keep the audio from crashing.
Oh, no problem. Okay, thanks. Well, we do have another question in the chat that I think really dovetails well with what you were just saying, Lee. Are there, Winnie Pfeiffer asks, are there any best practices you can highlight of LGBTI groups using the economic argument to, say, advocate for overturning criminalization laws and or other discriminatory laws?
Mm-hmm. Specific best practices. Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm understanding this right, so how can advocates best use this argument, and where has it been used before? Well, I think one thing is to be familiar with it and have a couple of data points, some numbers to go along with an appeal to a set of businesses. I think I think that's one thing. I mean, that's what I tried to do with the book. It's like got a crazy number of footnotes all in the back, so you never have to look at them unless you want them. If you want to know where something came from, where that 1% came from, you can find it there in the footnotes. But to provide some figures to back it up, I would say another thing to go along with that is that it's very helpful to have stories of people to illustrate those numbers. I tried to do that in the book because I think numbers don't, you never know exactly what people are understanding. But if you've got a story that tells you, here's an example of, our colleague who was bullied in school and, couldn't, whose parents, wouldn't pay school fees and couldn't finish school, whatever it was, to kind of show, examples like that, to talk about local examples of discrimination, to talk about, how to think about how LGBTI people can be a useful resource, either as customers or as workers in different kinds of contexts. But connecting the numbers to something local, something a little more real and visible, I think, in the course of those sorts of audiences. What I have heard from people is sometimes it's hard to get in the door of businesses. And so it's an interesting kind of dynamic where businesses say, well, we don't have any LGBTI people who work here. We've never seen any. Nobody's ever said anything. How likely is that? Not very. If it's a big company, especially. But people internally might feel unsafe in coming out and making the case for LGBTI issues. So I think there's, there've always been partnerships between the inside and the outside to try to figure out how to get the message to the people who need to hear it. So I think, thinking about it in that way sometimes is helpful. So I don't know, maybe some of that, I would love to hear if anybody in the session has had experience with doing this and what's worked well. I think you're probably much better experts on that aspect of it than I am.
While we hopefully wait to get some feedback on that point, there's a question from Jennifer Williams who asks, who writes, I'm transgender. My question, transgender people have a more difficult time in applying for jobs and getting past that first interview with HR if they're fortunate enough to get interviewed. How difficult will it be for transgender applicants, employees to be accepted, desired, to the level of LGBT employees? Also, are there necessary medical needs and insurance costs of transgender employees a strong impediment to our greater acceptance by corporations?
Questions. First, just say, LGBT people also face discrimination, so we should not be your benchmark for transgender people. But to think about, you know, equality with everybody, right? So regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. But the point that you're making about how hard it is for transgender people to get in the door and to get interviews is completely corroborated by the research that we have in lots of different parts of the world. Not just the US and Europe, but there's some great studies that came out recently in Malaysia and Singapore and some other Asian countries that show exactly that same dynamic. But I want to just point out, it doesn't mean that you never get in the door. It just means another way to think about it is you have to apply for a lot more jobs to get an interview. And that's a burden, you know, that's discrimination. There's no question about that. But I think sometimes we have to, you know, keep from talking ourselves into the idea that it's completely bleak and hopeless, because it's not. I mean, I think that there are some companies out there in lots of different places at any rate, maybe if not everywhere, that are more open to thinking about to hiring transgender people. So, you know, actually, a project I'm working on now is looking at programs that are out there that are going on for economic empowerment of LGBTI people, especially low-income LGBTI people. So I'm going to just have a little commercial here on the side. If you have any ideas for me, if the places to look, programs to look at, let me know. But one of the things that I have seen a few different places experimenting with are job fairs, trying to bring, for transgender people in particular in some places, trying to find employers, convincing them that there's a great set of potential employees out there that they should be open to, and trying to get them in the same room as transgender applicants for jobs to try to open up new opportunities for folks. So I think that's one thing. I have heard of other organizations that are working very directly with companies to encourage them, if not for the job fair, to at least, you know, to consider hiring transgender people and to take them on. So there are lots of efforts. There are things that we can do, and I don't think we're doing enough of them to make a difference there. The last thing I'll just say about the healthcare costs, because I think, you know, businesses do worry about things like that. But, you know, the experience we've had in the United States where for the employers who have carefully tracked costs is very small. It's negligible even, because the percentage of transgender people is very small to begin with. Not everybody wants to have surgery or treatments that require any kind of cost, and many of them are very low cost for hormone replacement therapy, for example, or psychological counseling. Those are all things that are, you know, that are covered for everybody. Why shouldn't they also be covered for transgender people? So, you know, a lot of people are trying to get that word out to companies that should not be an impediment to equal treatment. It's simply not. It's just, as people would say, it's very small.
We have a question from I think our former William Brown, unless it's another Taylor Brown, I apologize. Any thoughts on how arguments for multinational corporations on the economic benefits of LGBTI equality are being or may be adapted to influence environments in informal economies?
Oh, that is our Taylor Brown. Yes, good questions. And that is a really good one. And actually, I will just be totally honest with you. We know very little about this stuff in the context of informal economies. Informal economies are hard to track and hard to study. And I don't really know more than a couple of attempts to try to do that in different kinds of contexts for LGBTI people. So, you know, the multinational, so the multinational corporations, they're the formal side, you know, they're the ones with very regular procedures, and they, you know, they're expected to follow laws and you know, have internal rules and things like that, all the aspects of a formal part of the economy would have. So yeah, so it's not, I will just admit it's not entirely clear in that sense. That said, let's just think about those different pieces. People's health, people's education and skill level, and their, you know, kind of readiness for working in that formal sector. All of those things are held back by homophobia and transphobia, by the harms of exclusion. So, you know, flip it around and say, you know, people will be readier for that formal sector if we can reduce those issues, and, you know, that will again still be good for the whole economy. So I guess that's the, you know, those are the pieces that I would put together in that context. But I wish we had, and we should have more. We should know more about what's going on in the informal sector.
Thinking too about impact, when you have worked on these reports, like the one in India, for instance, do you have a sense of how those were received by decision makers in the country? Was there sort of a lot of skepticism? Did it get a lot of traction by you know, various folks, or what was sort of the life you know, of these arguments after they were put out in the public?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of interest from the public, and still is, I think, for these kinds of arguments. So we hear them, you know, I hear them coming back a lot in terms of, you know, the media. Journalists have been very interested in this, and the business journalists in particular. People in the business sector are using this argument. There's a great new book also by Parmesh Shahani, who works for Godrej in India. It's called Queeristan, and if you want to know about these arguments in kind of an Indian context, the business arguments, the economic arguments, with a lot of, as I put it, sort of a lot of glitter attached. He leads a much more glamorous life than this economist does here in the United States. But anyway, so Parmesh tells a good story. Anyway, it's a great book, so you should take a look at that. You know, so it definitely has gotten some traction there in certain quarters for sure. And again, I have heard from activists that it is something that they've tried to use in some ways, and so. You know, but I think India is, you know, kind of it's fertile ground for that sort of those sorts of arguments.
What I feel like this is the perennial question, but what data is missing, or what other data could we, you know, ideally use to help further advance the economic case? If you, you know, could sort of wave your magic wand over national, you know, statistical agencies and surveillance systems.
Yeah. That's a great question too. Well, let's think a little bit about what data are good for. I mean, the one thing they're really good for is showing us where we have problems, where there are existing inequalities. And actually it's interesting because when I wrote the book, you know, I started out thinking about this, you know, from the data deficit perspective, like, oh, there's just no data. That's what everybody says to me. There's no data. Actually, there's a lot of data. There are lots of LGBTI civil society organizations that have said, hey, we need to know something about people that we're working with. We need to be able to say, you know, it's not just to policymakers, it's not just this person or that person. There's a lot of people that we're talking about here. So there are lots of organizations doing some really interesting and creative and tough research on these topics. So I think that's really important, and they have revealed lots of inequalities. Now, the other thing that research can be good for, we hope, is to understand how the things that we do make a difference. You know, does policy matter? Does it really help people to have non-discrimination policies? Does it improve LGBTI people's lives? To answer that question, we need we need a different kind of data. I mean, we need different kinds of research studies that are kind of carefully designed so that you can tell the difference between, an improvement in, LGBTI people's income from the policy, so it's not just because we're in a great part of our macroeconomic business cycle and that's everybody's actually doing really well, right? So you have to, to distinguish between different possibilities, you need to design things carefully. To track changes over time in the actual lived experience of LGBTI people, we need to be able to compare them to everybody else's experience. So it means you can't, it's much harder, it's much less useful, I guess is the way to say this, to have community-based samples. Then you kind of get into the realm of the sort of research that national statistics offices do, where they're surveying the population and finding out about how well people are doing. They need to be including questions on sexual orientation and gender identity. Some places are starting to do that. And then we can compare. We can see, compared to heterosexual people, is there inequality? Is it getting smaller? Is it getting bigger? We can compare across countries. Here's the wage gap in the US. Is it bigger or smaller than the wage gap in Sweden or in Thailand? Those kinds of questions. So we need more data like that. And here's, there's a really interesting project that I just want to, we've been talking to. I've worked actually with Cliff Cortez on, and with the folks at Outright International, lots of other people maybe in the audience, called the LGBTI Inclusion Index. So this is something that the World Bank and the UN Development Program, in collaboration with lots of people, have been trying to create. So it would be kind of an overall measure of how well a country is doing on inclusion. And we can benchmark it, compare countries. We can follow them over time, see how well they're doing. But it will require, but there's big data needs there. So one of the data needs is, good comparable data on laws and policies, which we've got. We can do that. What's harder is we got to have that lived experience data. That's the piece that's just we've got to work harder. We've got to all dig in and kind of work on that. So that's something that we'll, be continuing to talk about and to work on, I think, on that particular project.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question earlier too about sort of the availability of or accessibility of these reports and some of the data you've referenced to. And I don't know if there's a way for Outright or for us to include something in the session after the fact, but certainly if you Google Williams Institute on our website, there are the reports that we've done. Googling the World Bank and economic costs of discrimination should take you to the India report as well. But we'll try to see if there's a way to send out more links to those specific reports.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes I have posted some stuff like that on my own website, leebadgett.com, if you're interested. But that'll take you to some of those other places too.
Great. There's a question from Jace Ritchie. I'm curious about the differences in acceptance for the range of identities within our queer umbrella. How has the case differed for trans and or intersex people versus for cisgendered homosexuals? How have the cases for equality of more marginalized people in our community been received across the globe? A data-informed response here is fascinating, and so grateful for the session.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually on the LGBTI Inclusion Index, that's another really important piece of that, is that we want to disaggregate the data so we can distinguish between the different levels of inclusion for lesbians, for gay men, for bisexual men, for bisexual women, for transgender people, for intersex people. It's gonna be hard. We never said it would be easy. So we have a lot less information, I think, about some parts. I think, with regard to people with intersex conditions or variations of sex characteristics, we don't know a lot at a very broad level about lived experience. I think we know more about laws and policies. So that's going to take a while. For transgender people, we're starting, there's this global knowledge base is developing that's emerging. And so I think it is possible to make the same kind of case for transgender people. I think, there's differences in size of the groups that might matter, but the underlying principle is really the same. You know, that businesses that want to be the most efficient, you know, cannot afford to, you know, reject people because of these kinds of characteristics that have nothing to do with how smart they are or how good a worker they will be. So so I think you can make that same kind of case. It's you know, I make it kind of all together, putting everybody together, because it's the same principles over and over again. And I'll just say, actually, I mean, I for those of you who are from the U.S., these are actually globally, we make this argument for gender all the time, for sex, for women, for cisgender women in particular. This argument gets made a lot. For people of color, it's been made for decades here in the U.S. about kind of the important contributions to the economy that we are missing because of inequality based on race. So, so there's lots of different ways to think about this.
Here's a great question about advocacy and sort of engaging other stakeholders around this economic argument. My country, with laws which criminalize same-sex conduct between men and cross-dressing by both men and women, is currently experiencing, I think that's an oil boom, that allegedly responsible for attracting a large number of investors, including many from the US. What advice can you share for supporting conversations similar to the present topic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would say sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, things are great, so how, you know, so there's no problem. You know, if things are going well in an economy, there's a temptation to do that. But I think that it's always important to remember, it's like, but you're leaving something on the table. Yes, we're doing well, we could be doing better. That's the way to think about it. We're not doing as much as we could be, or not as well as we could be. So that's a piece of it. You know, I think another way to think about it is to, you know, to think about the multinational companies that might be involved in that country that are more likely to have policies of equality and inclusion that are really specifically including LGBT people, LGBTI people. And I think, you know, they may be a resource in that sense, although I will say the oil, natural gas extractions industries are not the most progressive globally on LGBTI issues, but there are some that I think you can point to. And I would actually, just off the top of my head, can't give you specifics, but like going to the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index, you can go through there and find the ones that are doing better, for example. So that's another way maybe to think about it, and to perhaps enlist them in, you know, in highlighting the things that they do, you know, even if they're not actually advocating, but advocating might be a, you know, a possible path for them in certain kinds of contexts, but at least highlighting what they're doing and acknowledging that they have a different perspective on the question of LGBTI inclusion is a perhaps a tactic. I don't know, maybe somebody else out there has got some better ideas than that, but those are my thoughts.
That actually reminds me of a sort of interesting anecdote that you reference in your book about, I think it's Lord Brown from BP, and sort of his kind of stated regret, I suppose, for not being out or doing more actively during his tenure to advance LGBTI rights, you know, given the power and influence that a company like BP, you know, has to affect change.
Yeah, that is a great example. Thank you. Yeah, and they are, I think, of the companies in that industry, they are, you know, kind of one of the good guys on LGBTI inclusion at any rate.
I don't know if there are any more questions. Folks, feel free to chime in. But are there any sort of final thoughts you have, Lee, or you know, kind of parting notes on this economic case for LGBTI equality?
Yeah, well, you know, to me, it's kind of a living, breathing argument. I mean, I think learning from each other about how to use it and when it's useful, frankly, I think is a good thing. I think it's also important to, you know, to remember that it's not a substitute for the human rights argument. It's one that can really go alongside it. At the end of the day, you know, what this is just saying, you know, if we added up all of the human rights violations and certain kinds of areas that LGBTI people experience, it's a lot. It's a huge loss economically, and then so it's very easy, I think, then to make that next little step to say, and you know, and that means that we're losing out on the participation of a really, you know, potentially very talented group of people in our communities. So anyway, I think it's an argument that doesn't, you know, require an unquestioning acceptance of global capitalism. It's one that kind of holds companies' feet to the fire in a lot of ways, and we should, you know, we should continue to do that. But I think we'll be more effective if we can, you know, kind of get in front of them in terms of, you know, showing how it fits, you know, their other kinds of interests and missions.
Mm-hmm. And I would just echo your, I think, helpful point too about that we really are interested in as researchers sort of knowing how folks are using this, or to what extent these arguments have currency in their you know, context in which they're working. And so we want to know if there are ways to go about this, or ways of shaping the argument, or providing new forms of data that will better serve that. So you know, please take that to heart. We really want to hear from you.
Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure as always to chat with you, Lee, and thank you to Outright.
Thanks,
and to everyone for a really terrific session.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It was great chatting with you all, and I hope you have a good conference. Thank you, Jessica. I see you popping in here. Yes. This has been a great conference. This is yeah, I was at an earlier session, which was really great as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.